Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to talk about my November TBR. So November is a crazy month. There are so many great readathons happening and I wish I could participate in all of them. Instead of trying to do everything, I just picked a couple that seemed the most interesting to me and I will be participating in them to the best of my ability. So November is Indigenous Peoples Month. It's also Nonfiction November, which I really enjoy participating in. I've participated twice now and I will be participating in it again this year. I am not going to read exclusively nonfiction, but I do have a handful of nonfiction books picked out. And I'm hoping that my percentage of nonfiction reads will be a little bit higher this month than it is typically. There's also Historathon, which is hosted by Lindsay's Little Library, Gloria Z. Thompson, and On the Middle Shelf. This is a readathon that focuses on historical fiction. So I have several historical fiction picks on my list for Indigenous Peoples Month, so they'll also qualify for Historathon as well. And finally, there is also Netgalley November, and my Netgalley shelf, while it's been getting better month by month, it's still a little bit out of control. So I'm definitely going to be trying to hit a few of my Netgalley ARCs this month, just in an effort to continue to catch up on my requests. So let's talk about the books that I actually am hoping to read this month. This is kind of a pile of possibilities. It's not that I'm going to concretely read every single book on this list, but these are the ones that I'd like to get to. I have a stack of books that are from my bookshelf, and then I also have some books that I have through the Libby app or via Netgalley. The first book on my list is The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters. Amanda Peters comes from the Mi'kmaq tribe in Canada. July 1962, a Mi'kmaq family comes to Maine for berry harvesting season. While they're there, the family's youngest child, Ruthie, goes missing without a trace. Her disappearance will haunt her family for years to come. So this book is from my Netgalley shelf. It is an ARC that actually just released, I want to say today, and I'm really excited about it. We have a thriller about a child's disappearance. I think this is going to go into some really important societal commentary. We've got some cultural themes, a lot of stuff that sounds really interesting to me, and I just feel like this is going to be a really good read. I'm really looking forward to delving into it. Then I have Tread of Angels by Rebecca Roanhorse. Rebecca Roanhorse is from the Oke-Owinke Pueblo tribe. Goetia is a booming divinity mining town, segregated between the fallen, who have the ability to see the precious mineral, and the good and righteous people called the elect. Celeste and Marielle are two fallen sisters. They're related by blood, but raised in two separate worlds. When Marielle is accused of murdering a virtue, Celeste must defend her in the very secretive courts of the virtues. So Rebecca Roanhorse is one of my favorite authors. I absolutely love her Black Sun series. It has 2 books out of 3 published so far, and I have devoured each of them as they've come out, and I'm anxiously waiting the 3rd book in that series. I didn't realize that this was a Rebecca Roanhorse story. I was just looking for things to read this month, and I happened to come across this book, and I was so excited because, as I've mentioned, I really love Roanhorse's writing. So I'm really excited to get into this. I think this is a relatively short story, but I think it's going to be a really interesting one. Then we have Elatsoe by Darcie Little Badger. Darcie Little Badger is from the Lipan Apache tribe. Imagine an America very similar to our own, but shaped dramatically by the magic, monsters, knowledge, and legends of its people. Elatsoe lives in this slightly stranger America and has the power to raise the spirits of dead animals. When her beloved cousin is murdered in a town that wants no prying eyes, she must rely on her wits, skills, and friends to protect her family. So I have heard nothing but good things about this book. I saw a few reviews of it last year. I want to say I saw one on Grace's channel, which is at Books and Cooks. If I can find that review of this book, then I will make sure to link it in the description. So when I started putting this list together, this was one of those recommendations that started popping up again, and I was like, this is it. I'm gonna read it this year. So I'm really excited to get into this one. It sounds really interesting. I think it's a YA, which isn't always my bread and butter, but like I said, have heard really, really good reviews of this. Then we have Night of the Living Res by Morgan Talty. Morgan Talty is from the Penobscot tribe. This is a debut collection of stories about what it means to be Penobscot in the 21st century and what it means to live, survive, and persevere after tragedy. This is a book that I remember releasing last year, and I put it on my TBR, and then, my TBR is just never ending and I hadn't gotten to it. So I decided that I would put it on this year's TBR and make sure I did get to it this year. I'm really loving short story collections lately, and I especially love when they delve into deep themes like this one seems to do. I'm also not very familiar with the Penobscot tribe. And so I'm really interested in learning about this particular culture, the region of the country that they come from, and some of their stories and things like that. I'm really looking forward to getting into this. Then we have VenCo by Cherie Dimaline. Cherie comes from the Georgian Bay Métis tribe in Canada. Lucky St. James is a Métis millennial who's living in a tiny apartment in Toronto with her grandmother. Then one night, in desperation, Lucky finds a silver spoon that's etched with the words Salem. The spoon hums with otherworldly energy and she finds herself drawn to it. Hundreds of miles away, Myrna Good has been looking for Lucky. Myrna works for VenCo, a shady organization funded by dark money. So I believe this book came out a little earlier this year, and this was getting all the attention and reviews. And I remember wanting to read it at the time, and also once again adding it to the never ending TBR. So I'm glad to have it pop up right now, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it. I'm curious about this mystery element, what this spoon is, what the connection between Salem and Toronto is gonna be. I love books that incorporate that mystery and magical realism and fantasy and all of that. So I think this is gonna be right up my alley. Then I have My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones comes from the Blackfeet tribe. This is book number 1 in the Indian Lake trilogy, which was something I was unaware of. For some reason, I thought this was a standalone book, so I was a little surprised to see that there's 2 more books that come after this one. Jade Daniels is an angry half-Indian outcast with an abusive father and an absent mother, and a town that wants nothing to do with her. Horror movies are her only protection from the world. When blood starts to pour into Indian Lake, she pulls up her encyclopedic knowledge of masked murderers to predict how things will end. So I really enjoy Stephen Graham Jones's writing. I've previously read The Only Good Indians, which I have included in my list of 13 horror books that you should be reading for Halloween, which you can find up here. That is a fantastic piece of horror writing, and it has caused me to really want to read more of Jones's writing. So I picked this book up thinking it was a standalone, and come to find out, it's the start of a trilogy. I am anticipating loving this and probably reading the entire trilogy. So we will see how it goes. I think it has a really interesting concept, and I hear that if you're really into like horror movies, that this has kind of an ode to that. So we'll see how this goes. Then we have Woman of Light by Callie Fajardo-Anstine. Callie is a Chicana with Filipina and Pueblo roots. Luz Little Light Lopez is a tea leaf reader and laundress who is left to fend for herself after her brother is run out of town by a violent white mob. As Luz navigates 1930s Denver, she has visions that transport her to her Indigenous homeland in the Lost Territories. So I've heard pretty good things about this book. I know it came out a couple years ago and it was a book of the month feature. It was pretty popular when it was released, but it's been really quiet since. I haven't really heard much about it. I know my mom had some copies of it for her little free library, and I've been meaning to read it for a while, so I'm excited to finally get into it this month. Woman of Light is going to be included for my books for Historathon. Then I have 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good. Michelle is from the Cree Nation in Canada. Taken from their families at a young age, Kenny, Lucy, Clara, Howie, and Maisie are barely out of childhood when they're released after years of detention in a remote residential school. Without any skills or support, the teens cling to each other as they find their way in seedy downtown East Side Vancouver. So this book is somewhat new to me. I've heard of it briefly before, but I wasn't super familiar with it. When I was looking up books to include in my Indigenous peoples list, I was looking for some books that were set in Canada, and this is one that popped up with really good reviews. I think also that it covers a piece of Canadian and American history that's super important. Residential schools were a tool of genocide towards Indigenous populations that were used to completely wipe out cultures. Children were kidnapped from homes, forced to cut their hair, forced to give up their cultural practices, and oftentimes forced to convert to Catholicism. It's a brutal piece of history, and I think it's super important to make sure that, you know, we don't forget that piece of history so that it can never be repeated again. This is another book that I will be including in my Historathon TBR. Then we have a second book by Cherie Dimaline, and that's Empire of Wild. This book is based on the story of the Rougarou, a Métis legend of a creature that haunts the roads and woods. Joanne has been searching for her husband Victor ever since he went missing a year ago after their first serious fight. She's drawn to a revival tent where she finds Victor, except he doesn't remember her and he swears that she's delusional. This book sounds really interesting to me. I am really curious how this revival tent and religion is going to play a role in this man forgetting his life and his wife. I think the mystery element of the story is really interesting. I have never read Cherie Dimaline before, and now I'll be reading 2 of her books this month, so I'm really looking forward to that. Then we have Love After the End, edited by Joshua Whitehead. This is a short story collection featuring stories by Indigenous authors with two-spirit and queer heroes in utopian and dystopian settings. So this was a book that I was not at all familiar with. I was looking for a book that represented people that were two-spirit or queer, and this was a book that came up a lot in that search. It sounded really interesting, and as I mentioned, I've been really digging the short story collections lately, so I am really excited to get into this one. I don't know a ton about two-spirit traditions, and so I'm very interested in learning more. Then I have Sisters of a Lost Nation by Nick Medina. Nick is from the Tunica-Biloxi tribe of Louisiana. Anna Horn is always looking over her shoulder. When girls begin to go missing and the tribe scrambles to find answers, Anna struggles with her place on the reservation, but she's sure that the key to the disappearances lies in the legends of her tribe's past. So I believe, if I remember correctly, this book came out earlier this year or towards the end of last year, and it was a book that I was really hyped about. I actually predicted it for Book of the Month. I had hoped that Book of the Month would feature it because it sounded really interesting, and I love that there was like this mystery element and maybe some magical realism, some folklore included in the story. And unfortunately they did not pick it up, but it's been on my TBR ever since. I have a copy of it that just came through Libby, and I'm really excited. I'm going to be listening to the audiobook of this one. Then I have Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. Joshua is an OG Cree two-spirit storyteller from the Peggy's First Nation in Canada. Johnny Appleseed, a young two-spirit indigiqueer, becomes a cybersex worker and exploits himself to make a living. When his stepfather dies, he has 1 week to return to the reservation for his funeral. As Johnny prepares to go home, he must figure out how to put together all the various pieces of his life. So I've heard very good things about this book. I remember this being really popular a few years back, and this was also one that's been sitting on my TBR for a bit, and I'm excited to finally get to. And as I mentioned previously, I don't know a whole lot about two-spirit beliefs and culture, so I'm really interested to learn a little bit more via this book and just kind of have a better understanding of what being two-spirit means. Then I have the book The Ghost Dancers by Adrian C. Lewis. Lewis is a member of the Lovelock Paiute tribe, which is actually here in Nevada. This book is set in 1988, and it follows a character named Lyman Bean Wilson, who is a Nevada Indian and a middle-aged professor of journalism at Lakota University in South Dakota. He is reassessing his life. Although Bean is the great-grandson of Wokova, the Paiute leader who initiated the ghost dance religion, he is not a full-blood Indian, and he endures the scorn of the Pine Ridge Sioux, whose definition of Indian identity is much narrower. I haven't heard very much about this book. I actually found this at a local bookstore here in Las Vegas. It's a used bookstore, and I saw it on the shelf. The colors of the cover really called to me. And I had heard a bit about ghost dancing, and so I picked it up thinking that this was a nonfiction, and it turns out to be a novel. I know that Lewis has since passed away, and I've heard that this was a little bit unfinished at the time of his passing. I'm pretty much going into this book blind, and I'm really interested to see what it's about. So then I have a couple books by Louise Erdrich. Erdrich is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and she is probably one of the most famous Indigenous authors in the United States. She has a huge backlog of books, and I've read a couple of them, and it's kind of hit and miss. I really loved her book, The Sentence, which I read in 2021 shortly after it published. I thought it was really quirky, really interesting, and very sharp social commentary. But I have struggled through some of her other books. And so I have The Roundhouse and The Plague of Doves, both which are critically acclaimed. The Roundhouse won the National Book Award, and The Plague of Doves was nominated as a Pulitzer Prize finalist. So I've heard good things about both of these. I don't know in great detail what either one is about, as I'm finding that going into Erdrich's writing blind kind of tends to be better for me because I don't set up any expectation. I'm hoping that both of these are going to work really well for me, and I believe that both of these will actually qualify for my Historathon TBR as well. Then I have Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. Jessica is from the Sucker Creek First Nations in Canada. This book is about a character named Mackenzie who wakes up with a crow's head in her hands and panics. Only moments earlier, she had been fending off masses of birds in a snow-covered forest. In bed, she blinks, and then the head disappears. Night after night, Mackenzie's dreams return her to a memory from before her sister Sabrina's untimely death, a weekend at the family's lakefront campsite, long obscured by a fog of guilt. But when the waking world starts closing into, a murder of crows stalks her around the city. She emerges retching water from a nightmare of drowning, and she gets threatening text messages from someone claiming to be Sabrina. Mackenzie knows this is more than she can handle alone. So I have been hearing really good reviews of this book. I know that this is kind of a horror, thriller, magical realism elements. I have only heard maybe one or two people critique this, and they typically critique the magical realism part of it, but I think this sounds super interesting. I love magical realism. I've really been on a horror kick lately. This sounds like everything that I really am going to enjoy, and this is probably my most anticipated read on this TBR. Then I have The Removed by Brandon Hobson. Brandon is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation tribe of Oklahoma. In the 15 years since their son Ray Ray was killed in a police shooting, the Echota family has been suspended in private. The mother Maria increasingly struggles to manage the onset of Alzheimer's, and her husband Ernest. Their adult daughter Sonia leads a life of solitude punctuated only by spells of dizzying romantic obsession. And their remaining son Edgar fled home long ago, turning to drugs to mute his feelings of alienation. With the family's annual bonfire approaching, an occasion marking both the Cherokee national holiday and Ray Ray's death, and a rare moment in which they openly talk about his memory, Maria attempts to call the family together from their physical and emotional distances once more. But as the bonfire draws near, each of them feels a strong blurring of the boundary between normal life and the spirit world. So this sounds really interesting to me. I think this is going to be maybe a book that focuses on grief and loss, but kind of from a horror mystery element. I love that this is going to talk about family dynamics and how people communicate after a tragedy. This author was previously a finalist for the National Book Award, and I know that this book received a lot of critical acclaim as well. I've never read Brandon Hobson before, but I'm really looking forward to delving into this. Then I have Warrior Girl Unearthed by Angeline Bully. She's a member of the Ojibwe community in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. This book follows Perry Firekeeper Birch, who has always known who she is, the laid-back twin, the troublemaker, the best fisher on Sugar Island. Her aspirations won't ever take her far from home, and she wouldn't have it any other way. But as the already striking number of missing Indigenous women continues to rise, as her family becomes embroiled in a high-profile murder investigation, and as greedy grave robbers seek to profit off what belongs to her Anishinaabe tribe, Perry begins to question everything. In order to reclaim this inheritance for her people, Perry has no choice but to take matters into her own hands. So I read Firekeeper's Daughter previously by Angeline Bully, and really loved it. I thought it was such an interesting book. It was really well written, suspenseful. It was young adult, but it didn't feel very juvenile. So when I saw that Louise was coming out with a new book, I knew I had to order it. It was featured by Book of the Month, so I made sure to order it in my box, and I have had it on my shelf for a couple months, so I think it is time to get to reading it. And finally, I have a couple nonfiction selections. First up is Fresh Banana Leaves by Jessica Hernandez. Jessica is Maya Chorti and Zapotec. This is a book where an Indigenous environmental scientist breaks down why Western conservationism isn't working and offers Indigenous models informed by case studies, personal stories, and family histories that center the voices of Latin American women and land protectors. So this book sounds really interesting to me. I have been very fortunate to travel pretty extensively through Latin America, and one of the things that is really interesting is the dynamic between Indigenous culture and modern society. Having traveled through the Amazon and through some of the jungles and rainforests in Central America, it's really unique seeing how Indigenous communities preserve the nature around them and protect their environment. And I would love to learn more about these practices and how they could be incorporated on a larger scale in the world to protect the environment. Then I have a book called I, Rigoberta Menchu, written by Rigoberta Menchu. Rigoberta comes from the Maya Quiche people of Guatemala. This book is a recounting of Rigoberta's experiences growing up in Guatemala as an Indigenous woman. She is often experiencing racism and poverty and unequal access to opportunities. And then there is a genocide that begins against the Mayan people of Guatemala. And her story goes into that genocide and what has happened to many Indigenous peoples throughout the country. Rigoberta did eventually escape, and when she got out of her country, she found a woman to translate her works, and this book was published. It did eventually win her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, but it came with some controversy. There was a person in the United States who I believe was from Stanford University who traveled to Guatemala and challenged some of the claims in this particular book. I'm not going to get into that right now in this particular instance. I may actually do a whole entire video after I've read this book and possibly had a chance to read some of the counter claims against it. But what I will say is that this book brought a lot of light to the plight of the Mayan Quiche people in Guatemala, to the genocide that was occurring, and it put enough international pressure on the Guatemalan government that the genocide and war was eventually stopped. I recently was in Guatemala literally last month, and the scars of this war still exist in the country. This was something that was mentioned to me and Oz by multiple people. We were told about places to go to learn about the war history, and we met lots of local Guatemalans whose parents were involved or were victims of this particular war. So while this story might not be the most 100% accurate in terms of timelines or stories or the way that it's told, I think that it's still a really important narrative because it captures the suffering of the Guatemalan Mayans and what happened to them from 1960 all the way to the mid-1990s. And finally, we have The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Treuer. David is from the Ojibwe Nation in northern Minnesota. This book is described as a sweeping history and counter-narrative of Native American life from the Wounded Knee Massacre all the way to the present. So I have been really interested in reading this book for quite a while. This is a book that I think is going to address the common narratives around Indigenous peoples in the Americas. I'm really curious to learn about Native culture and how it has changed and evolved from the Wounded Knee Massacre all the way to present day. I also think it's super important to challenge any stereotypes or misinformation that I might have picked up in my life just due to the media and things that I've been exposed to. And so I've heard that this is just a really well done, really well researched book. And so I'm looking forward to really learning and delving into the history. So that's my pile of possibilities for the month of November. As you can see, I have a handful of books for Historathon, a handful of books for Nonfiction November, and a handful of books for Netgalley November. But the thing that they all have in common is that they are written by Indigenous authors. And while November is Indigenous Peoples Month, and I'm super excited to be focusing on Indigenous authors this month, that doesn't mean that we only read Indigenous authors in November. We should be reading Indigenous authors throughout the year, because when we read diversely from people of all sorts of different backgrounds, I think it makes our reading life so much richer and so much more interesting. I will continue to try to read Indigenous authors throughout the entirety of the year, but I just wanted to make sure that for this particular month, I really focused on a handful of books by some remarkable Indigenous authors. So that being said, I hope you liked this video. If you did, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and let me know what's your favorite book by an Indigenous author, or what books are you looking forward to reading this month? Are there any books by Indigenous authors that you think I should be including on my TBR? I am definitely open to picking up more books throughout this month if anything amazing comes across my way. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.